Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we try to cut through some of that strategic noise and really get straight to the essence of complex thinking. Today, we are immersing ourselves really in the foundational conceptual phase of military action. I mean, the cognitive steps that determine if an operation is set up for success long before the first unit ever moves.
And, we have to acknowledge that this process, while it looks structured on paper, is inherently fragile. It really requires an extraordinary blend of technical expertise and, well, imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah, the tension inherent in military planning is, I think, perfectly encapsulated by a quote that kind of frames our entire discussion today, attributed to President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
That statement, it just captures the core challenge, doesn't it? The current operational environment is often characterized, as volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It demands adaptability. And Joint Publication 5.0, the Doctrine on Planning, it repeatedly stresses this. The joint force has to be prepared for challenges that are transregional, all-domain, multifunctional. So the value isn't the physical document, the plan itself, but that shared understanding developed during the process.
Okay, so our mission today is really to unpack the thinking required to operate effectively in that kind of complex environment. For this deep dive, we are drawing heavily on some essential doctrinal sources.
Yep.
We've got detailed excerpts from Joint Publication 5.0 on planning, the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook, and also a pretty fascinating intellectual analysis of military innovation found in the work, creativity, and military complexity.
And our goal for you, the listener, is really to give you a shortcut, maybe, to understanding this initial, most crucial phase of planning. How commanders and strategists move from that broad political direction and strategy to a truly cohesive, executable conceptual foundation.
And that requires both mastering the joint planning process doctrine and a huge amount of creative thinking.
It really does. It's both art and science.
Let's try and unpack this by starting with the very concept that governs this initial phase: operational design.
Okay, operational design. Fundamentally, it's the cognitive approach commanders and staff use, and it's supported by skill, creativity, judgment, to link the tactical employment of forces all the way up to strategic objectives.
So it's the bridge.
It is the bridge, yeah, between the high-level policy of national leaders and, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines actually executing missions on the ground, in the air, or at sea.
Now, operational design is often discussed alongside operational art. How should we think about the difference between those two concepts? Are they the same thing?
That's a good question. They're related but distinct. Operational art is more the fundamental creative thinking. It uses skill and judgment to apply military force, generally relating to designing, planning, and executing whole campaigns and major operations.
Okay.
Operational design, on the other hand, is described in the sources as the method with operational art inherent in its framework.
Okay.
So think of design as providing the conceptual structure.
The scaffolding.
Exactly, the scaffolding. And operational art provides the creative insight, the ingenuity needed to fill that structure effectively. And the whole purpose of using operational art and design together is specifically to help commanders and staff understand the strategic and operational environment, and critically, those wicked problems associated with achieving the overall political objectives. We'll definitely get into wicked problems more later.
Okay, so design is the framework, art is the flair used within it. You mentioned the commander's perspective. The sources are pretty clear this process is fundamentally commander-centric.
Yes, definitely.
But if the Joint Force commander owns the visualization, how do you prevent the staff who are doing all the detail analysis from maybe subconsciously tailoring their input to just confirm the commander's initial hunch? Where's the kind of friction built in to ensure robust critique?
That's a really crucial question.
Yeah.
It touches on organizational psychology as much as doctrine. And while, yes, the commander owns the visualization and the ultimate decision, the process is meant to be iterative, not just linear.
So it loops back.
It loops back. The staff's role isn't supposed to be mere compliance. It's active analysis and, importantly, challenge. Joint Publication 5.0 actually requires recurring touchpoints, structured feedback loops.
Like what?
Well, often these take the form of formal design seminars where the staff presents its findings, including potential alternative interpretations, risks, different ways of seeing the problem back to the commander. But, it relies heavily on candor and intellectual honesty being built into the organizational culture. That's the key.
And that intellectual honesty, it has to start with understanding the why, right? The strategic context. The sources really stress this overriding importance, and it echoes thinking from well, centuries past.
Exactly. This brings us straight to the first and most critical principle, always keeping the strategic context in mind. Clausewitz noted it so profoundly: no major proposal required for war can be worked out in ignorance of political factors.
War as an instrument of policy.
Fundamentally, war is an instrument of policy, full stop. If the political goal changes, even slightly, the military plan has to adapt immediately. That strategic context provides the conceptual foundation, the purpose, for the military design of any campaign or operation. If the military objective doesn't nest cleanly under the political goal, the whole plan risks becoming, well, strategically irrelevant, no matter how tactically brilliant it might be.
Okay, so once that strategic direction is confirmed, the methodology for this initial design phase breaks down into 4 steps, though you said they're continuous and cyclical, right? Not strictly sequential. This is according to Joint Publication 5.0 and the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook.
That's right. The process is recursive, meaning we often loop back as new information comes in or the situation changes. But conceptually, yeah, we begin by first understanding strategic direction and guidance.
So what does leadership want? What are the constraints?
Exactly. Absorbing the national policy, the political objectives, and the constraints, rules of engagement, resource limitations, political sensitivities set by civilian leadership. Then second, understanding the strategic environment.
Moving from policy to the real world.
Right. Analyzing the systems at play. We'll talk more about systems. Third, defining the problem. This is framed by the gap between where we are now and where we want to be.
The current versus desired conditions.
Precisely. And finally, fourth, developing the operational approach. This is the conceptual way we intend to close that gap, the broad strokes of the solution.
And crucially, those first 3 steps, they're all about getting that foundation right, making sure we truly understand what we're facing, why we're there, and what problem we're actually trying to solve before anyone even starts thinking about specific actions or, drawing arrows on a map.
Getting the problem definition right is probably the most critical part of the entire process. Everything flows from that.
Okay, so moving into that second step, understanding the environment. Planning begins by expanding our view, right? Moving from the sort of abstract strategic environment to the more detailed operational environment.
That's right. And this requires a really holistic view. It has to cover all the relevant domains. You've got the physical domains, land, maritime, air, space, but also the non-physical domains like the information environment, which definitely include cyberspace.
We need to look at the entire chessboard, like you said earlier, not just the pieces right in front of us.
Exactly.
Now, this sounds like standard comprehensive analysis, maybe, but the key distinction that's emphasized in the sources is applying a systems perspective. Why is systems thinking so necessary as opposed to just, compiling a big list of facts about the area?
Because warfare today, especially in the environments we're talking about, it's not a linear equation.
Yeah.
It's not A plus B equals C. It's a complex adaptive system.
Meaning things interact in unexpected ways.
Precisely. We use comprehensive analytical frameworks like the classic political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure, PME, SII as it's often called.
Right.
But just analyzing these categories in isolation, making separate lists for each, is insufficient. It could actually be really misleading.
Okay, so walk me through that. If I map out the political system, who's in charge, what are their interests, and the military system, who has the weapons, where are they, what am I missing if I don't look at the interrelationships?
You miss the leverage points. You miss the feedback loops. You miss how the system actually behaves. For example, the status of the local infrastructure, say, the water supply or the power grid, directly impacts the ability of the economic system to function.
Okay, makes sense.
And if you, say, bomb a bridge, well, tactically, you might affect the military's supply routes, the military aspect, but you also disrupt the ability of the local populace to get food, which is the social dimension. And you might damage the credibility of the supporting government, which is political, you see.
Yeah, it ripples outwards.
It ripples. The critical requirement in design methodology is appreciating these interrelationships among the PMESI categories, their subordinate components, and other relevant factors like the local populace, maybe external actors, because these relationships define the system's resilience, its vulnerabilities, how it will react to stress.
And I see the doctrine specifically integrates intelligence processes here, things like the joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment process. That must be running concurrently, feeding into this step.
Oh, absolute vital, and yes, concurrent. That intelligence process provides the necessary granularity, the detail. It informs the design step by identifying crucial geospatial considerations. Terrain, key infrastructure locations, and potentially tentative enemy centers of gravity. We'll definitely dive into that linchpin concept shortly.
Okay.
But that intelligence, combined with the broader PMESI systems analysis, paints the current picture of the operational environment. It tells us where we are.
And the whole point of defining the current environment where we are is to measure the gap between that current, often undesirable state and where we want to go. That tension, that gap, is what ultimately frames the problem we need to solve.
Exactly right. Commanders and staff have to clearly define the desired operational environment. And this is formally described by the military end state.
Okay. The military end state, let's clarify that because I think it's sometimes misunderstood.
Yeah, it's important. The military end state is the set of military-related conditions that, once they're accomplished, mean the military instrument of power is no longer the primary means required to achieve the remaining national objectives.
So primary being the key word there. It doesn't necessarily mean absolute victory, peace declared, everyone goes home. It means the main effort shifts.
Precisely. It's a transition point. The end state conditions describe a specific desired state of behavior or stability, perhaps, that allows for the transfer of responsibility to other instruments of national power: diplomatic, economic, informational.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say the current undesirable condition is a local government is being threatened with military force by an adversary group. The desired condition, described in the military end state, might be something like the adversary group no longer possesses the organized means or resources to project significant military force against the local government, allowing for normalized diplomatic engagement and economic reconstruction efforts to take the lead.
Okay, so it's about creating the conditions for other things to succeed.
Exactly. Defining this end state clearly is crucial. It helps prevent endless military involvement or mission creep because it sets a specific goal for the military component of the strategy.
Okay, so we've understood the strategic direction, we've analyzed the environment using systems thinking, identified where we are and where we want to be with the end state. The next step is defining the problem. And this seems to be where the doctrine explicitly demands a shift in our cognitive gears. We stop dealing with merely complicated situations and have to confront true complexity.
This is, perhaps the most critical distinction in modern design methodology. And it draws heavily on the theory of wicked problems. We absolutely have to distinguish clearly between complicated problems and wicked problems.
Okay, what's the difference?
Complicated problems. Think of calculating a precise firing solution or designing a standard logistics chain, maybe fixing a complex mechanical engineering issue. They're difficult, sure, they might have many parts, but they're generally solvable.
Predictable.
Largely predictable, yes. They have multiple independent components, but they tend to work in a more linear, predictable fashion. Convergent thinking, the kind of thinking that aims for a single correct solution through logic and analysis, is perfect for complicated problems.
But things like counterinsurgency, stabilization operations, hybrid warfare, these feel different. They're messy, unpredictable.
Those are the wicked problems, absolutely. Wicked problems, it's a term we draw from planning theorists. Riddle and Weber, they defy simple definition and easily found solutions. Well, for one, if you ask 10 different experts to define the core problem in a failing state, you'll likely get 10 different answers. Because the way you define the problem is inherently interwoven with the solution you have in mind.
Ah, okay.
They're unique. There's no universal template or formula for solving them. What worked in one counterinsurgency might completely fail in another. And critically, attempting to solve a wicked problem like, say, defeating an insurgent group may unintentionally create additional, previously unforeseen dilemmas.
Like empowering a worse rival group or destabilizing a region's economy.
Exactly. Those kinds of second and third order effects. Solving one aspect might worsen another aspect you didn't even realize was connected.
So the danger here isn't just failing to solve the problem, but maybe the danger of resolving it, fixing the immediate symptom and mistakenly thinking you've cured the disease.
That's the cognitive trap, precisely. Resolving problems, meaning fixing the immediate issue right in front of you, like maybe successfully stabilizing one specific district without addressing the underlying political corruption or economic grievances that fuel the instability across the whole region, that can often lead to systemic failure down the road.
Because you treated a complex problem like it was just complicated.
Right. Decision makers, especially in stressful situations, operate under immense cognitive load. And if they mistakenly apply a complicated linear solution onto a complex, wicked system, that resolution will almost certainly have undesirable long-term consequences that weren't foreseen because they were focused only on the short-term fix.
So the problem statement, then, is the planner's kind of intellectual bulwark against this cognitive trap. It forces a deeper look beyond the immediate tactical fix.
It's intended to be, yes. It provides the intellectual discipline that frames the entire subsequent planning effort. The problem statement is the planner's answer to those fundamental questions. What's really going on here, and why is this happening?
Not just what is happening, but why.
Crucially, why? It needs to identify the areas of tension, the competition, the opportunities, the root causes that are preventing us from reaching the desired end state. If the command team identifies the wrong root causes, if they fundamentally misunderstand the problem they're trying to solve, then the subsequent plan, no matter how detailed or well-resourced, will likely fail to attain those desired end state conditions.
Okay. And the focal point of that problem statement, the thing that often helps crystallize the why, is the center of gravity. This seems like a really critical concept, maybe sometimes misunderstood. Let's dedicate some serious attention to this analytical linchpin.
Absolutely. The center of gravity, or COG, construct. It's really an indispensable analytical tool. It's used to identify both friendly and adversary sources of strength, power, will, but also weaknesses and vulnerabilities related to that strength.
So it's the core thing.
It's often described as the primary source of moral or physical strength, power, and resistance. Or, put another way, it's the thing that, if defeated or neutralized, would lead to the enemy's collapse or render them incapable of achieving their objectives. For the enemy, it's the primary problem we need to overcome. For us, it's the critical element we absolutely must protect.
And getting it wrong can be catastrophic.
The doctrine is clear. A hasty or faulty analysis of the center of gravity can have the most serious consequences. It could potentially result in the inability to achieve objectives at all, or at least not at an acceptable cost in terms of time, resources, or lives.
Let's use that famous World War II example that comes up in some of the sources. The Battle of Midway. The Japanese commander Yamamoto's operational objective was, essentially, the elimination of the American Pacific Fleet as a fighting force.
Correct. Now, for the American side, Admiral Nimitz and his staff, through brilliant intelligence work and analysis, correctly identified that the Japanese center of gravity for that specific operation was not the entire Japanese Navy, which was huge.
Right.
It was specifically the 4 veteran first-line aircraft carriers, the Kido Butai. These specific carriers were essential to the attack plan. They were the linchpin that made the entire operation viable for the Japanese. So Nimitz laid his plans specifically to find and eliminate those carriers, gambling heavily on intelligence and precise timing.
And the outcome changed the course of the war, but what's critical to remember, you mentioned earlier, is that this element, the center of gravity, it's not static, is it?
Not at all.
No.
That's a common mistake, identifying it once and sticking with it. A center of gravity must be continually analyzed, reevaluated, and refined based on friendly actions, the threat's reactions, and just the general fluidity of the operational environment.
So, using the Midway example again, if the U.S. had failed to sink those carriers initially...
Well, then the Japanese center of gravity might have remained the carriers for a while longer. But if, say, the U.S. had sunk them, maybe the Japanese COG would then shift to something else, perhaps their remaining surface fleet, or their land-based air power on islands, or maybe even the political will of their government back home to continue the fight despite the loss. It's a constant process of assessment and reassessment.
Okay. Now, to make that center of gravity analysis actionable, to turn it into something planners can actually use, the doctrine requires using associated elements, primarily critical capabilities. How do these help guide the planning?
Right. This is the structure that helps turn that conceptual analysis into potential military action. Once the center of gravity is identified, let's say, for the enemy, it's their ability to wage sustained offensive warfare.
Yeah.
You then have to break down how they achieve that. What enables that COG?
What does it do?
Exactly. Critical capabilities are the primary ways or functions that are essential for the center of gravity to achieve its objective or purpose. And they're always expressed as strong verbs within an operational context. For instance, the enemy's critical capability is to project long-range strike capabilities, or perhaps to sustain combat forces forward effectively.
So it's an action, a verb. Once we have that verb, we look at the nouns, the things required to make that action happen.
Precisely. Once those key capabilities are identified, planners then need to determine two more things related to each capability. First, critical requirements.
What does it need?
Yes, what are the essential conditions, resources, means needed for that capability to actually function? So if the capability is to project long-range strike, a critical requirement might be operational airfields, or access to specific long-range munitions, or maybe skilled pilots and maintenance crews.
Okay.
And second, critical vulnerabilities. These are aspects of those critical requirements that are deficient or vulnerable to neutralization or exploitation in a way that will affect the critical capability itself.
The weak points.
The weak points, exactly.
Sure.
So using the airfield example, a critical vulnerability related to the operational airfields requirement might be lack of redundant fuel storage facilities at those airfields, or maybe dependence on a single, easily interdicted supply route to get parts and ammo there.
Ah, okay. So that entire framework, identifying the center of gravity, then its critical capabilities, then the requirements for those capabilities, and finally the vulnerabilities within those requirements, that is what links understanding the problem to actually developing a plan.
Yes.
It moves the discussion from a vague, we need to stop the enemy, to something much more specific and actionable. Like, we need to disrupt the enemy's ability to project force by targeting their critical vulnerability of non-redundant fuel infrastructure at their key airfields.
It creates analytical discipline. It helps ensure that military resources, which are always finite, are focused on the most consequential levers of power, the things that will most effectively undermine the enemy's center of gravity or protect our own.
This whole process, especially when we're talking about confronting these wicked problems, it really suggests that planning demands more than just, rote application of doctrinal steps or checklist conformity.
Oh, absolutely.
It seems to require a very specific cognitive approach, which the source creativity in military complexity addresses head-on. This brings us to a core cognitive challenge: balancing convergent thinking and divergent thinking.
Yes, this is crucial. The military environment, paradoxically perhaps, demands both types of thinking, but the organization itself often leans heavily, sometimes too heavily, toward convergent thinking, especially in peacetime.
Remind us convergent thinking is.
Convergent thinking focuses on reductionism, on analysis, on finding a single correct answer through logic and established procedures. It's ideal for those complicated, predictable problems we talked about, things like standardizing procedures, optimizing maintenance schedules, ensuring logistical predictability. It's about finding the right answer from known options.
And the military organization is often incubated in this during peacetime.
You could say that, yeah. There's a strong focus on standardized operating procedures, drills, logical deduction. Because, frankly, safety, efficiency, and interoperability demand it in many routine situations.
But when the iron dice roll, as one source puts it, when conflict actually starts and the environment becomes truly complex and adaptive, when the enemy reacts unpredictably, when friction and chance take over, planners and commanders have to be able to successfully pivot to divergent thinking.
That's the art, isn't it? That's the critical pivot. Divergent thinking requires the expansive exploration of possibilities, of unconventional ideas, generating multiple potential solutions or approaches, often without knowing which one is right initially. It's essential for dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty, and novelty, the hallmarks of wicked problems in complex systems.
So the organizational tension lies in being able to make that cognitive pivot effectively when needed.
Exactly. If decision-makers misapply the wrong approach, if they try to shoehorn a linear convergent solution onto a truly complex adaptive problem, the results can be disastrous, because that solution likely only addresses a very limited set of variables and fails to account for the system's emergent behavior.
But the military is, by its nature, a high-risk institution. It has inherent organizational constraints, hierarchy, disciplines, standard procedures that seem like they might actively resist the kind of freewheeling creativity often associated with divergent thinking. How do you square that circle? The need for unquestioning obedience in some situations with the need for intellectual freedom and challenge in others?
That is the fundamental organizational dynamic tension, you're right. And there are no easy answers. Instinctive obedience and unquestioning conformity are absolutely essential in critical, high-risk, time-constrained tactical situations. You need soldiers to follow orders instantly when lives are on the line.
No time for a design seminar under fire.
Precisely. So, the military has good fundamental reasons not to encourage unfettered, random innovation across the board. Some doctrine, in fact, rightly cautions against over-innovation. There's this concept of conservatism by choice, being deliberate about change, not just changing for change's sake. And you also have unexamined self-stabilizing influences, deeply entrenched bureaucratic processes, cultural norms that actively resist change within the organization, sometimes just for self-preservation or out of deeply ingrained safety concerns.
That structural reality suggests then that the military can't simply, I don't know, copy-paste innovation ideas directly from the successful corporate sector, even from companies renowned for their creativity.
That's a point that warrants serious caution. And the source creativity in military complexity addresses this directly. Corporate mindsets are often heavily influenced by profit-linked metrics. Their practices are frequently motivated by hyper-efficiency, minimizing waste, things like just-in-time logistics. They want to be lean.
Whereas the military needs redundancy.
The military often requires just-in-case capability. We absolutely must maintain readiness and stockpile war reserves for unlikely but potentially catastrophic high-impact scenarios. That runs counter to lean thinking. Furthermore, the military invests heavily in things like character development, leadership under pressure, courage under fire. These are needs that run entirely counter to purely commercial notions of maximizing profit or eliminating inventory. Our bottom line is national security, not quarterly earnings. Efficiency is good, but effectiveness in achieving the mission is paramount.
So, given this inherent tension, the need for rigid conformity sometimes, the need for adaptive creativity at other times, how does a large hierarchical institution actually foster the ability to adapt and pivot cognitively when required? How do you cultivate that divergent thinking capability?
Well, the sources offer several constructive levers, things organizations can do to promote a more innovative and adaptive culture without sacrificing necessary discipline. One really established and highly valuable practice is the exchange of personnel on professional military education courses, PME.
Sending officers to study elsewhere.
Exactly. Both within the United States system, sending Army officers to Air Force schools, for instance, and crucially, international exchanges. This provides invaluable exposure to alternative ways of thinking, different cultural approaches to problem solving, what you might call epistemic diversity, just different ways of knowing and seeing the world. Bringing these external, sometimes challenging ideas back into the organizational mainstream is a crucial piece of the puzzle for fostering organizational change and adaptability.
And that seems to tie into the concept of supporting local initiatives, maybe empowering more junior leaders to engage with these design concepts.
Absolutely. Supporting internal workshops, projects, even just planning exercises that explicitly invoke design thinking concepts, something that's called alternative thinking or adaptive red teaming. This encourages participants at all levels to practice thinking differently, to challenge assumptions, without necessarily violating critical safety or core doctrinal standards in actual operations.
So it's a mix of top-down and bottom-up.
Ideally, yes. It requires top-down leadership that sets an organizational culture genuinely valuing intellectual curiosity, constructive dissent, and learning from mistakes.
Yeah.
But it also requires bottom-up empowerment, investing in individual cognitive development, and providing opportunities for people to practice these less convergent ways of thinking.
Ultimately, the source material seems to argue that forward-leaning leadership has to be willing to embrace calculated risk rather than waiting for 100% certainty or proof of concept, especially when confronting those wicked problems where perfect information is simply unobtainable.
Yes, it's a strong theme. The source urges leaders to accept calculated risks, to be willing to deploy solutions or approaches that might initially be deemed only, say, 70% viable if the potential reward outweighs the perceived cost of inaction or waiting for perfection.
That sounds like Patton.
It echoes military history, definitely. General Patton's famous quote is highly relevant here. "A good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week." This kind of thinking needs to extend to planning and doctrine development too. It's often the willingness to accept some imperfection, some uncertainty, that enables organizations to swiftly deploy innovations or capitalize on fleeting opportunities in a dynamic environment.
Okay, so let's assume the commander and staff have navigated the strategic context, they've understood the environment through that systems analysis lens, and they've framed the wicked problem, perhaps using the center of gravity analysis we discussed. Operational design then provides the necessary structure to translate all that conceptual work into something approaching executable action. This sounds like the classic connection of ends, ways, and means.
That's exactly what it is. Operational design helps the commander articulate the strategic goals in ends through a chosen operational approach, the ways using the available military resources, the means. The various elements of operational design provide the consistent lexicon, the common framework and language for this visualization, ensuring everyone on the staff, and ideally subordinate commanders too, are speaking the same language about the conceptual solution.
Let's try and make this more concrete. Maybe you refer back to a historical example like Operation Torch, the initial Allied landings in North Africa in 1942, or perhaps the subsequent planning for Operation Overlords, the D-Day landings. Torch seems like a great example because the political factors were so paramount there.
They really were. For Operation Torch, the political context arguably defined the operation even more than the purely military challenge did. The operation's success hinged almost entirely on the political attitudes and ultimately the reactions of the Vichy French forces controlling North Africa at the time. Would they fight? Would they comply?
A huge uncertainty.
Massive. So the initial design elements had to account for this huge variable. They needed to address potential political compliance or resistance, which meant the military end state itself had to be flexible enough to accommodate negotiation and cooperation on one hand, or rapid escalation in combat on the other. This is pure Clausewitzian wisdom in action. The political factors fundamentally shaping, even overriding, the tactical reality on the ground.
But even within that complex political context, the military planning still requires detailed consideration of fundamental operational elements like logistics, time, distance, particularly operational reach. How does that fit in?
Operational reach is absolutely fundamental. It's defined as the distance and the duration across which a joint force can successfully employ its military capabilities while still maintaining acceptable effectiveness.
How far can you punch and for how long?
Basically, yes. And when planning major operations like Overlord, Normandy landings, the ability to rapidly capture or develop usable airfields in Normandy was identified as a key operational decision point directly related to reach.
Why was securing that forward basing so critical to operational reach in that case?
Well, think about the alternative. If the Allies had failed to quickly establish those forward airfields on the continent, they would have been severely limited to providing long-distance air support based solely back in England.
Which means
Huge constraints, fewer sorties per aircraft per day because of the travel time, less time actually loitering over the target area providing support. Immense strain on fuel logistics and pilot endurance. By securing forward air bases in Normandy relatively quickly, they significantly extended the operational reach of their ground forces deeper into the French interior, ensuring that effective close air support was available when and where it was needed most.
And that constraint, the limitation of reach, if it's not addressed properly in planning, it can lead pretty quickly to what the doctrine calls culmination, right?
Yes, culmination is another critical concept in operational design. It's generally defined as that point in time and space where the attacking force no longer has the capacity to continue the offensive successfully, or conversely, where the defending force can no longer successfully sustain its defense.
Running out of steam, essentially.
Running out of steam, running out of supplies, maybe running out of will. For the attacker, reaching culmination is often preceded by pushing their operational reach too far, leading to exhausted troops and crucially depleted resources and fragile supply lines.
So planning for sustainment, managing the timing and tempo of the operation is absolutely crucial to forestall reaching that culmination point prematurely.
Precisely. The integration and synchronization of logistics and sustainment with combat operations from the very beginning of planning is key to forestalling culmination. When theater logistic planners forecast the expected drain on resources over extended distances and durations, they have to figure out how to generate enough military resources, fuel, ammo, food, replacements at the right times and places to ensure commanders can achieve their objectives before hitting that culminating point.
And if the resources just aren't projected to be available,
then the commander, working with the planners, must fundamentally revise the entire operational concept. Maybe the objectives are too ambitious for the available reach. Maybe the tempo needs to slow down. Maybe the phasing needs to change. Ignoring logistical constraints is a recipe for failure.
Okay, beyond logistics and distance, planning also requires arranging the various operations in time and space, determining the overall tempo and structure, often through phasing. How does that work?
Right, operations are usually arranged as a combination of simultaneous actions happening across the area and sequential actions where one sets the stage for the next. This often involves phasing. Phasing basically segments the overall operation into more manageable blocks or stages, primarily to ensure that the necessary conditions are set in one phase before moving on to the next.
So phase one might be securing air superiority. Phase 2, establishing a beachhead. Phase 3, breaking out, something like that.
Exactly, that kind of logic. Now, doctrinally, phasing should ideally use condition-driven rather than purely time-driven terms for transitions, meaning we should aim to move to the next phase when specific observable conditions are met on the battlefield, for example. Phase 3 begins when enemy forces are disorganized in Sector A and Key Bridge X is secured. Not just because the calendar dictates Phase 3 begins at 0600 on Tuesday.
But there seems to be an obvious tension there. Because resource availability, unit deployment schedules, higher headquarters directives, even national political timelines, those are very often time-constrained. How do planners reconcile those condition-driven operational needs with the time-constrained realities of logistics and deployment?
That is a constant source of friction in planning. You're absolutely right. Planners have to constantly reconcile the reality of time-oriented deployment of forces and sustainment, which often follow fairly rigid logistics schedules, with the ideal of condition-driven phasing of operations, which should follow the dynamic events on the battlefield.
So how do they manage it?
The practical solution usually lies in building clear, measurable criteria for phase transitions that are both descriptive of the desired conditions and time-aware or time-constrained. For example, instead of just saying, Phase 2 begins when forces are ready, the transition criteria might be something like, Phase 2 begins when friendly forces control 2 main supply routes. And D, 80% of the necessary sustainment for Phase 2 operations has arrived in theater, estimated NLT, not later than day 14. It tries to marry the condition to a realistic time window.
Okay, that makes sense. And sometimes, within that phasing, an operational pause might become necessary, even though it seems to carry risks.
Yes, operational pauses are sometimes required, sometimes unavoidable. These pauses can be used deliberately to support strategic decisions, maybe creating space for de-escalation talks or allowing for negotiations. Or, more commonly, they're needed operationally to regenerate combat power, allow logistics to catch up, or reposition forces for a subsequent push.
But the downside is losing momentum.
That's the primary drawback, yes. There's a significant risk of forfeiting the initiative, allowing the enemy time to recover, reposition their forces, strengthen their defenses, or even launch a counterattack. So if pauses are deemed necessary, commanders and planners should try to plan them carefully. Perhaps alternating pauses among different components or sectors, shifting the main effort temporarily to try and keep continuous pressure on some part of the enemy system, even if the main offensive is momentarily halted in one area.
And finally, throughout this entire complex process of arranging operations, managing reach, phasing, there needs to be a constant push for anticipation. Always looking forward, right?
Absolutely essential. Anticipation is about constantly leaning forward, trying to set conditions for future success, and attempting to adapt proactively to the surprises that the sources are very clear will happen in an uncertain future.
How do you plan for surprises?
Well, it involves not just developing the primary plan, the main course of action, but also thinking through branches and sequels. Branches are contingent actions you plan for based on expected changes or enemy actions. If the enemy does X, then we will do Y. Sequels are major follow-on operations that you might execute after the current plan is successfully completed. This kind of forward-looking planning demands constant intelligence collection and refinement to help orient the command team and the planners toward that uncertain future, reducing surprise where possible and enabling quicker adaptation when it inevitably occurs. #tag conclusion.
Wow, okay. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've gone from the highest levels, the political purpose of war, all the way down to the very cognitive processes required to craft even a starting concept for military action. If we try to distill the core lessons of this deep dive into operational design, what are the key things our listener really needs to hold on to?
Okay. I think the first thing is that this initial planning phase, this operational design piece, it's not just a bureaucratic checklist exercise. It's not simply a matter of resource allocation, matching units to tasks. It is fundamentally a deeply cognitive process.
It's about thinking.
It's about thinking, yeah. Specifically, thinking focused on framing a unique, often wicked problem, situated within a complex adaptive system. And doing that effectively requires having the right cognitive tool set available. That includes the willingness and ability to pivot to divergent thinking when complexity really demands it. And it also requires the discipline to apply the analytical rigor of things like center of gravity analysis and that systems thinking perspective we discussed.
And the true power of that whole process, it seems, isn't necessarily in the final physical product, the written plan itself, but more in the shared understanding, that deeply analyzed foundation that gets created during the planning effort.
Absolutely. Let's revisit Eisenhower's wisdom one last time. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Why? Because the operational environment is volatile, it's uncertain, the enemy gets a vote, friction happens. So the plan, the document itself, will change, maybe almost immediately after execution begins.
So the real value is?
The real enduring value of all that intensive planning, that operational design effort, is providing that shared conceptual foundation. It incorporates the strategic context, the analysis of political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure systems, the identification of centers of gravity and vulnerabilities. Having gone through that process means that commanders and staff have a common frame of reference. They can adapt more quickly. They can reframe the problem together. They can continuously assess the situation and make adjustments when the enemy inevitably surprises them, or the political winds shift, or things just don't go according to the initial script.
So ultimate success really lies in that adaptability, which, as the source Creativity and Military Complexity notes, often requires a degree of organizational courage to accept calculated risk.
And this raises, I think, a profound and perhaps challenging final thought for every military organization, especially those built on the necessary foundations of caution, procedure, and conformity. The question is, how do these organizations effectively bridge that inherent psychological and organizational gap, that tension we discussed between compliance and creativity, between certainty and ambiguity? How do they truly embrace calculated risk? How do they foster an environment where innovative solutions can be developed and deployed, even when they might only be deemed, say, 70% viable on the ease of execution?
That willingness to accept calculated imperfection, maybe in the pursuit of seizing the initiative or achieving a breakthrough.
That's it, that willingness, that judgment, that courage. Perhaps that is the ultimate measure of a truly adaptive and effective planning culture in the face of complexity.
A vital question indeed, something that demands ongoing dialogue, continuous organizational reflection, and probably constant reframing.